was it?
20 years.
Oh, we should take time off up there back in the old days. Yeah. So I've been in a couple of great spot outlets.
Alrighty, hello everyone here and on Zoom. Thank you for joining us tonight for this special discussion of Freak Out by Tony Wellington, how a musical revolution rocked the world in the 60s. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're currently on here in Meanjin, Brisbane, which is the Yuggera and Turrbal people. And as we're live streaming across the country, the traditional owners of the land where you're joining us from. I pay elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just some general housekeeping. If you do need the bathrooms, they're just inside and upstairs, and the bar will be open throughout, so you can grab a drink as you like. We will have time for a Q&A towards the end. So please, if you're on Zoom, type your questions through, and the Zoom host inside will pass them along to me. And then the Zoom host will also just post a link where you can purchase your copy of the book. And for everyone in person, we've got copies at the front counter as well. In conversation with Tony tonight, we have Sean Sennett. Sean is a Brisbane-based music writer and musician. As the owner of Time Off magazine for 2 decades, Sean interviewed over 1,000 artists from local and unsigned bands to the likes of David Bowie, Iggy Pop, and Bruce Springsteen. Very impressive. He has written about music for The Age, Rolling Stone, The Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and Word. Sean now hosts the podcast Sony Music Presents Time to Talk. Sean has written and recorded music with Rob Hurst, Kate Severano, Steve Kilby, Ross Wilson, Casey Chambers, and more. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Tony, great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And thanks so much for doing this. And thanks to Avid Reader, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember years ago I was doing a radio thing and the host said to me, the 90s was the best decade, wasn't it? And I said, like, the 90s aren't even in the top 5, right? It's got to be the 60s. Now, it might seem an obvious question. Why did you choose the 60s to focus your energy on the book?
A number of reasons. First of all, of course, because the 60s was very influential in terms of my musical development and my understanding and appreciation of music. It was a really heady decade, and in a way I wanted to rediscover why it was that the music of the 60s was not only so incredibly influential and transformative at that time, but remains so today. And so it was an attempt really to better understand the milieu that influenced me, but also influenced music.
Well, I remember, I think it might have been Paul McCartney or somebody once said that it felt like every year went for 10 years because so much happened in that year. And it was interesting with your book, obviously it's a chronological arc. You felt it was important to talk about Australia in the 50s and what the 40s was like before you set it up.
Yeah. I mean, I think before you can discuss the 60s, you have to understand what preceded it. So I do a sort of thumbnail sketch, if you like, of what was going on in the 50s that led to the explosion of the 60s. And when we say 60s, sometimes people are talking about sort of 65 to 75.
Yeah.
But in the case of Freak Out, I'm dealing with that decade alone.
Yeah.
But the meat of the book really starts in sort of 64 when the Beatles really, transmogrified music per se.
Yeah, I kind of felt the first part of the book, I like the way Australia's in there with, you've got JOK, the rise of those TV shows that are happening. It's like the world's in black and white, then we go to colour, don't we?
Yeah, it is a bit like that. And indeed, that replicates what happened to television, certainly in the USA too. But it was what you're in a way alluding to is a technological revolution, which is very much part of what happened in the 60s. When the Beatles toured, there was no amplification for the drums, and they were singing through the PA of the boxing ring. And that was the same by the time they got to Shea Stadium. They were still singing through the localised PA. Marshall stack amplifiers were coming next. By the end of the decade, you've got Led Zeppelin and, other big name bands playing to huge audiences with these massive amplifiers that simply didn't exist at the beginning of the decade. And that, along with transistors, which changed the ability of people to be able to listen to music wherever they went, including in cars, the changes in terms of music recording, multi-tracking. The Beatles never actually got to use 8-track, a year before Sergeant Pepper's, you know, Brian Wilson was using 8-track recording and the Beatles still weren't allowed to use it. You know, it was crazy. But, you know, all of those changes, Moog synthesizers, you name it, all happened in the 60s.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, the technicians had to create the gear to match the vision of the artist, didn't they?
Indeed, and the artists were really pushing. And indeed, you read the writing of George Martin, you know, the fifth Beatle, and he was absolutely thrilled for them to continually be coming to him with challenges that really made him tear his hair out, but ultimately proved incredibly influential.
It's interesting. I mean, the book sort of starts with like people like Johnny Ray you talk about. By the end, it's the MC5. That's a huge jump over the space of that amount of time, particularly when you sort of look back in the last 10 years. And you talk a little bit towards the end of the book about how people consume music now. And because it's people perceive it as being free because they can stream it, even though they're paying subscriptions, you feel it's lost value for them socially.
Yeah, and I have to be careful what I say because what neuroscientists have written about is that everyone absorbs music in their teens and early 20s, and that becomes the framework for the rest of their life by which they judge all future music. So for someone who was a teenager in the 90s or the noughties, that is their, you know, that's their focus. That's what's important to them. But what was different in the 60s was that there was less music. So we were more focused on it back then. You could go in a record shop and flip through the new release, whereas today there are 9 million songs being uploaded to streaming services every year. Wow. So, you know, there's this thing called, you know, the quandary of choice, whereby the more you have to choose from, the less satisfaction you get from it. No worry that, you know, music doesn't quite have the cachet that it used to have back then.
Well, you know, people talk about the monoculture, don't they? Where, I mean, even for Australia, you go back to the 80s, we were still in the monoculture. Everybody went and saw pretty much the same bands. We watched the same TV shows. We all watched Matilda do the wink at the Commonwealth Games. What do you think society is losing by having so much choice?
Well, I think that, you know, obviously there is less capacity for communitarian pleasure in a certain genre or field. Everything's split up. People who love K-pop focus on K-pop. Whereas in the 60s, you know, Normie Rowe released the biggest selling single in Australia, and it was K Sarah Sarah on one side, which is a Doris Day song, and on the other side was Shaken All Over, which is a rock and roll song. That wasn't considered enjoy Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night then. Because in a way the genres hadn't been named, they hadn't been defined, they were there. The genres that we're still listening to now were largely created in the 60s, but they weren't formulated, they weren't, you know, confined back then. So there was this broad panoply of songs and styles that everyone got to choose from.
I met Normie Rowe once and I could see he was thinking, oh no, fans going to approach me. So I just said, Normie, your version of Shaken All Over is the best version of all time. Even better than Johnny Kidd and the Pirates who did it originally. Johnny Chester did a better version. So I've never
Humility from Normie.
Is a couple of times in the book.
He does.
Because of course, maybe we should talk about first of all the rise of the teenager before we get to Normie. Because there was a time when teenagers didn't exist, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And indeed, up until the 50s, the notion of teenagers really was not a thing. It started, if you like, in the very late 40s, but really developed through the 50s. And partly that's a product of baby boomers. That is, even in the 60s, the number of people aged between 14 and 25 increased by 40% in Western countries. Much the same here and in England. Combine that meant that any time they when young people actually felt themselves to be decidedly different to the rest of society. Thus the famous saying, don't trust anyone over 30.
So what was the big bang for the teenager in Australia? You talk about Bill Haley and Elvis and the Blackboard Jungle as a film. When did rock and roll catch a light in Australia, do you think?
Well, in a way, it was Johnny O'Keefe, and he'd gone and seen Blackboard Jungle, and he missed the song at the beginning, but he caught it at the end. There's an instrumental version in the middle. But when he heard the song at the end, he thought, wow, that's what I want to do. No one else had thought that at the time. So this is 1955. So Johnny O'Keefe looked to pick up a band that could play that vernacular. And what he found was that the rock and roll players of the day couldn't actually play this new form.
Yeah.
So he had to go to jazz players. So he got Bob Birtles and Mike Knock, the great jazz pianist from New Zealand. It was jazz players that actually made up the first rock and roll bands in Australia, because they were the only ones who really understood it and could play it properly.
And did rock and roll kind of boom during that time, or was it a slow burn? I know Culture and those people were very popular.
Yeah, and Vic Assange, who was, you know, an Australian First Nation person who actually started playing rock and roll too, and there were some women rock and rollers. And it took off 55, 56, 57. Johnny O'Keefe's Wild One, there's 58 from memory. But then it petered out because the music business started to try and control things.
Well, that's the different. Elvis went to the army, right?
Elvis went to the army. Surf music started to become the new genre. There was still, you know, blues and R&B filtering out. But basically what happened in terms of record sales is from the late 50s to 63, before the Beatles arrived, record sales plateaued. In fact, I think 1 year only they went up, and that was by about 1.2%. But by the time the Beatles came in 64, when they took America by storm and the British invasion began, suddenly record sales were double-digit growth for the rest of the decade.
I guess the interesting there is too, isn't it? You know, the 45s, the EPs, and the rise of the album, which kind of happens during the course of your book in the 60s. So by the time we hit A Hard Day's Night, people are buying albums again, as opposed to...
Well, even a bit later than that. I think the single was still quite big then, but it was around, you know, sort of 67 in particular, Good Vibrations followed by Sgt. Pepper's, really significant in terms of the LP as artifact. Both of these albums were albums that simply couldn't be played live. And so suddenly the LP was the artifact of choice for serious rock stars. So, you know, when Cream began, Eric Clapton used to say, I'm not interested in singles. Singles are commercial. I don't want to do commercial. I want to do art. Art is an LP.
So in the early part of the 60s, you've got all the migrants coming out. You mentioned the book, The Easy Beats were all migrants.
The Twilights.
Yeah, and then the Gibb Brothers, of course.
Yep.
And then they all decide they want to go back, don't they? They want to try and make it back in the UK.
Yeah, and it's not because some of them have come from there. It's simply because it wasn't easy to make a proper living in Australia, even if you had hit singles in the 60s.
Right.
The population wasn't big enough, and the royalties coming back were minuscule.
Sure.
So, yes, you could make something of a living by going to dance halls and clubs and that sort of thing, but not by selling records. So everyone, and the other thing that was happening during the 60s was, of course, that Australian radio stations were totally fixated on British and American acts, not Australian acts. They weren't really interested in playing Australian acts.
Well, it's interesting in the book, you talk about the amount of cover versions that were done of American singles and British singles before they were hits here. Was there a quote of Australian music they had to play that was covered by the cover versions they would do?
No, it was just that it was purely imitative, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so, Australian bands would get as far as they could, whether it was the Easy Beats, the Twilights, the Group, Normie Rowe, Johnny Farnham, you name it. They ultimately all got as far as they could here and then set their sights on England. And that was all helped by the Hoadley's Battle of the Bands, of course, because the winning band got a free ticket on Sitmar cruises to go to England. And so they'd get to England and suddenly discover two things. One, that it was incredibly competitive in London.
Yes.
And two, that the music they were playing was usually a lap behind what was going on overseas.
Sure. There's the thing, wasn't it? The Bee Gees, when they finally get back to England, They got off the boat and somebody told them bands are over. You know?
But then they met Stigwood.
Well, Stigwood's an interesting character. The Stigwood, of course, appears in your book. And he's a fascinating entrepreneur from Australia going to England to try and make it.
He did, indeed. And fortunately, he caught up with Epstein's company, you know, NEM Music. And of course, the funny thing about the Bee Gees was that Stigwood realised that if he was going to make a hit with this band, he had to use a bit of subterfuge. So their first single that went out had no band name on it and was styled like the Beatles. The harmonies sounded just like the Beatles. And they sent it out to records, to radio stations, and the radio stations all started to play it, thinking it was the new Beatles album. And of course, a new Beatles single. And then, of course, they had to come clean and say, no, it's not. And no one believed them at first. They thought, oh, Bee Gees is a pseudonym for Beatles. But the same trick worked in England as it did in America when they released the single there too.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, too, there might have been a lag on the Beatles releasing something because they're spending so long making Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah.
So radio were desperate for a Beatles-sounding song.
Indeed.
It's interesting with the Beatles, out of all the great music made in the 60s, they are the band that you give a lot of space to when it comes to breaking down various albums. You sort of see the sonic shifts they made. I mean, I think it was a 3-year gap between Please Please Me, I Want to Hold Your Hand, to Turn Off Your Mind, Relax and Float Downstream.
Yeah, but if you think about the trajectory, I mean, the basic spine of the book is that popular music, rock and pop, changed more dramatically in the 60s than in any other decade. And if you think about that trajectory from 1963, 64, I Want to Hold Your Hand, 4 years later to Sgt. Pepper's, which has changing time signatures, orchestral effects, tape loops, you know, it's just from a humble little love song to Sgt. Pepper's in 4 short years shows how far the Beatles were willing to stretch, not just themselves, but their audience. And in fact, they left parts of their audience behind as they went because the audience couldn't keep up, some of them, but they were still the spearhead up until Sgt. Pepper's, and after that it tapers off.
Well, it's interesting in your book too, because there's a particular year where it's the Monkees and Jimi Hendrix. So it's kind of, we've got television pop music and we've got a guy setting his guitar on fire.
Yeah.
And as you say, you could quite easily be a fan of both.
Yeah. And I mean, that was, and they're put together because, in fact, Hendrix was the support act for a Monkees tour.
Crazy.
And, you know, his manager, Chas Chandler, had booked him to tour with the Monkees, thinking probably that it might create some friction. And indeed, it did. There was an organisation of very wealthy, well-to-do American women who were absolutely offended at this juxtaposition because it was teeny boppers that were going to the concert, and there was Jimi Hendrix mock fornicating with his guitar. So he only lasted, you know, the first half dozen concerts.
Yes.
But what he found was that the teeny boppers were screaming over the top of Purple Haze because all they wanted was Davy Jones.
Sure.
Bring on Davy, and they couldn't hear Purple Haze. And Jimmy just said, "Oh, to hell with it."
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's a remarkable time. It's the thing I like about the book is you tell these sort of stories about what's happening in the UK, the politics in America, the music in America, but you keep bringing it all back to what's happening in Australia at the same time too. How can you even sum up, you know, the massive cultural shift we experienced in that time?
Well, I mean, it was global. It wasn't just Australia. Australia didn't really enter the global kind of fray in terms of youth culture until the Beatles hit. And then Australia experienced something that it had never experienced before, which was tens of thousands of young people disobeying their parents, disobeying the police and authorities, climbing drain pipes, breaking into motels, you know, rampaging airports, causing riots. It hadn't seen this before, you know, only in a very small scale in the 50s. And so from there on in, you know, the youth culture really blossomed, and youth culture was really hungry for anything that came out of England or America. And that was emboldened, of course, by Top 40.
Well, I think it was Richie Benaud once said that up until the 50s in Australia, everybody said yes. And after that, they started saying why. And why should we do that? Indeed. And I mean, what the other thing that really strikes me about the 60s is that
young people actually thought they could take over the world. They thought they could restructure society as a whole. And if you think about it, little Patty with Stompy Wompy Surfer Boy, she was, 14 at the time. Lulu was 13 when she started having hit singles. She was managed from the age of 13, or had hit singles from the age of 15. Stevie Wonder had his first top 40 hit at age 13, was touring the world at 15 with a band.
Yeah, amazing.
I mean, here was proof that young people could take over the world. Rock and pop music was dead set proof that there was a place for young people on the planet.
Now, Vietnam's a big part of the book too. And LBJ's trip to Australia, of course. What was the move then? So you also write about things like the Rise and Sunset Strip. I mean, things like Vietnam on the doorstep. Were these other sort of little social atom bombs that were happening around the world impacting Australian youth?
I think very much so, because the other thing that happened in the 60s was that international news services were suddenly sharing information at a much faster rate than they ever had before, which meant early on in the 60s, that information about what was going on overseas was filtering through. And by the mid-60s, you know, the March on Washington would take more column inches of newsprint in Australia than a moratorium march in Sydney or Melbourne, you know, because these were much bigger events. And then by the end of the 60s, you had all the underground newspapers as well. And here in Australia, of course, the university newspapers, Honi Soit, Thorunka, etc., were really feeding that.
You know, sort of circling back to Normie Rowe. So we've got the rise of the teenager. Normie becomes a pop star. And of course, he's drafted to go to Vietnam. And in your book, you mentioned how a retired colonel admitted on his deathbed that they were making an example of Normie and an example to youth.
Indeed, indeed. So,
him.
yeah, so Normie was drafted, but his number never came out in the lottery. He was never pulled out of the barrel. And yes, a retired senior officer from the army on his deathbed explained to his son that he'd set it up, and they did it as a PR job to try and improve relations between Australian people, or they're thinking about the Vietnam War, by having a celebrity go over there.
Yeah.
And the gentleman asked his son to take an apology to Normie Rowe. Wow, which is just extraordinary, really. The subterfuge was quite amazing. And then, of course, Normie was the inspiration for the first time, and it took a long time for a hit single in Australia to reference the Vietnam War, which was Smiley by Ronnie Burns, you know.
Written by Johnny Young.
Written by Johnny Young about Normie Rowe, how Normie Rowe had gone to Vietnam and come back a changed person.
Yeah.
And so he wrote this song, Smiley, about how you never seem to smile anymore.
At one point in the book, towards the end, 1968, you sort of break down the chart. And even as a lot of Australian music being made, it's still very heavy, even at that end of the 60s, on English and American.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, there are times when in the book I note of the top 25 hit singles, you know, in the middle of the 60s, only one will come from an Australian performer. They're all relegated way down because they just weren't being prioritised. And as a young person in that time, my influence was much more British and American music. And I was taking risks importing Fugs albums through David Jones, which had the potential to be confiscated, you know, by the censors. Because I was much more interested and focused in what was going on in America. You mentioned MC5, etc. It seemed so much more vibrant. Sorry to all the bands, the Australian bands that were operating in the 60s. And I was certainly listening to, you know, all of, you know, Johnny Farnham and, you know, Johnny Young and all of that. I was listening to all of that. But what was going on in America by the end of the 60s, when suddenly, you know, heavy metal, which wasn't even named yet, was bursting through the speakers, was so far ahead of what was going on in Australia at that time.
When do you think that Australia kind of had that thing where commercial radio got on board and the music got on board and they collided and Australian music dominated? I mean, you talk about Daddy Cool in 71. Did you feel it was then or maybe later with Sky?
No, I think my thesis, it really is, and people are welcome to disagree, but it wasn't until we reduced the drinking age from 21 to 18 and pub rock took over. And then you see suddenly pub rock becomes the thing for Australian music. That's the edge that Australian music had. AC/DC, Mondo Rock, you know, etc. Midnight Oil. These are pub bands. And it was pub music that really made the rest of the world stand up and take notice of Australia. But that couldn't have happened without what had gone on in the 60s, whether it was Blue Cheer or, you know, Iron Butterfly or MC5 or Led Zeppelin, etc.
Well, I remember talking to Greedy Smith once for an interview, and he said the pub rock thing was really also about, was it the 5 o'clock swill, where people would come home from work, have time for one beer in a pub, then they clear them out. They'd make these massive beer bars, get everybody in, and then of course they'd be empty.
Yeah, but that was well before rock music started playing in in pubs.
I think he was arguing when that was over, they still had these massive rooms that needed filling.
Yeah,
so
I see.
Put a PA system in the way we go.
Interesting.
So in terms of you know, the research you've done, you talk a bit about First Nations people in there, and it was interesting. Was it 1967? 90% of people agreed that First Nations people should be included in the census.
91%, and it's still, I understand, the highest positive vote ever received in a referendum.
Wow!
But it did take till 1967 before Aboriginal people, because up until then, the Constitution had actually specifically denied them a consideration of being called Australian citizens. It had actually stated that in the Constitution. So they had to have a referendum to change the Constitution in 1967 simply so they could be included in the national census. Isn't that incredible?
Crazy. And so the great Jimmy Little, was he a quiet revolutionary in his own way?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. And in a way, he did it because he didn't ruffle feathers. He wasn't coming on hard saying, I'm an Aboriginal, I deserve this. He kind of, and Cole Joy, of course, helped many Aboriginal artists. He was so generous, Cole Joy. I mean, we have to give credit where credit's due. And he encouraged so many First Nation artists in the early days to perform and took them on tour, et cetera, et cetera. And Jimmy Little, of course, he was nominated Australian of the Year and all that sort of thing, and paved the way really for Lionel Rose. Who, went from boxing to music and so on. So there is this tradition that actually goes back to the mid-50s of our First Nation people playing rock and roll and being noticed for it. But at the same time, you know, what was happening out in Moree and elsewhere was pretty unconscionable.
And when you talk about the way women are represented in the book as well in the 60s, in terms of the music sphere, was it Go Set had 47 covers for the year and there's 2 women?
2 women, yeah, that's right. And the interesting, to give Go Set its due, they quickly realised that a lot of their readership was young women who wanted the pin-ups of the rock stars, the male rock stars. So they were one of the first to introduce a sort of a Dear Dorothy type column where they gave advice on, you know, should you have sex and, you know, how to leave home and without upsetting your parents and all that sort of stuff. So they recognised a female readership, but still it was a blokey business.
Yeah, well, if you read the Jim Keys passage in your book, I mean, that
this is where Jim Keys stupidly described what it was like to be in a rock band and talked about the band moles that used to appear in his house and suddenly take their clothes off and ask him to judge their bosoms and that sort of thing, and how this was a daily occurrence. And he ended up getting copping a lot of flack for it. And indeed, someone painted Band Mole's Paradise on the road outside his house.
So I'm curious about your process for the book. When did you make the decision, do you want to tackle something as big as the 60s?
Well, actually, I was still kicking around in the political arena, and I knew that this was a book that had been bubbling away in the back of my mind. So in my quieter moments, I started reading, you know, rock biographies and that sort of thing. So it had been gestating for a few years. And when I was left politics, I got one book out of the way, which is actually a book on wildlife, and then immediately started on this one, which has been gestating probably for about 5 years or so.
And in terms of your process, you read a lot of other books, and then did you kind of hit the typewriter first thing in the morning? Did you have a goal each day? How did you go about putting it together?
No, I never had a goal, but as my wife will attest, when I start working, I'm a bit of a terrier.
Just kept going.
And so, and it just kept growing. And to be honest, the first version I sent to the publishers was significantly longer.
Yeah, right.
It was 185,000 words. This is 130,000.
Right,
So
okay.
I handed over the manuscript and they went, whoa, people don't buy thick books, Tony.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had to go back and there was a whole lot of stuff had to come out. But it's probably a better book for it.
It's in the DVD extras. Right? Yeah. Have we got any questions down there?
My much younger generation than you, but so I do pick up tidbits from the media over the decades. And it's interesting how you were saying that rock and roll and pop music was sharing with the youth that they could actually take over the world. And was there not a stage where politicians were actually trying to stop rock and roll and music for that reason? And if that was true, going back on things I've read, have they succeeded, the politicians, in doing that today? Because of COVID now, gigs have been stopped. I've got tickets now that have rolled over to next year, and as of in a few days' time, I won't be able to go to any because I'm not vaccinated. So have they, if that message was true back then, has politicians actually succeeded in achieving that?
Look, rock music wasn't revolutionary until really 1965, when you got these extraordinary group of songs, starting with Subterranean Homesick Blues, which simply changed, I shouldn't say simply, which changed the notion of what lyrics could be. But then you had I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which was a cry from young people to say, we're not going to play with this society, we're not going to be materialists, we're not going to be defined by what you say. And then quickly on the back of that, Get Off of My Cloud. And then My Generation by The Who, which actually had that wonderful line, I hope I die before I get old. And suddenly rock in 1965 became provocative, it became belligerent, it became aggressive, and top 40 music hadn't been those things really before. It had been highly energetic, but it hadn't been so pugnacious. And at that time, yes, there were a lot of politicians, a lot of educators, who were really starting to reel from what was happening, because you couldn't have a demonstration without having live music performed at it. At the Chicago riots, just before the Chicago riots, MC5 were there in Grand Park hammering away their music. So the music itself was revolutionary. It wasn't just what was in the lyrics. The music itself was revolutionary. And yes, so there were attempts to stop all live concerts in San Francisco, stop live concerts in cities and towns in Australia, anything to prevent this kind of groundswell. But ultimately, of course, the groundswell won. I think it'd be a bit of a long bow to suggest that COVID restrictions were focused on the music industry. I think, that's probably a little bit of a bridge too far, but it has had this very unfortunate impact on an industry that is always struggling, and particularly struggling in a day and age when it's really hard to be noticed within the music industry, where live music is so important. Once upon a time, you sold records, which brought people to your concerts. Now you've got to have concerts so people go and stream your music, So things have shifted.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering about kind of the influence of drug culture also in the 60s in terms of other things you touched on have been things that hasn't really occurred to me that of course there was all those teenagers post World War II. Do you touch on that in the book as well, Tony?
Absolutely, that crops up, right throughout the book. Dylan turned the Beatles on to marijuana. Timothy Leary, of course, was making, Owsley, Owl, otherwise known as, was busy making LSD in great big tubs. And, it's something like the Trips Festival, which was early 1965 in San Francisco. Everyone was being given tabs of LSD, absolutely everyone, because it wasn't yet illegal. So, yeah, I mean, all of that was part of the maelstrom too. But what quickly became apparent between the sort of mid-60s and the end of the 60s was that no one becomes smarter by taking drugs. A lot of people may have used it as an excuse for inspiration, but ultimately it became a real problem. Within a year of the Summer of Love flowering, Haight-Ashbury was full of, drug addicts and people stealing from one another to try and feed their habit. So it had an ultimately destructive effect as well as an inspirational effect, but it was absolutely part of the whole kind of milieu. Yeah.
Your quote from Paul McCartney at the end is quite interesting. He said he sort of feels like he's actually waiting for the 60s to happen now.
Yeah, and I don't try and explain that. I leave that to the reader to try and interpret. But to me, what he's suggesting is that it was unfulfilled.
Yeah.
The 60s never quite
promise,
claimed
the dream of it.
That's right. The brave ideal that we could refashion society through something as simple as loving one another. And indeed, this is a very important part of the book, and I'm glad you steered us towards it, Sean. And that is that the thing about the 60s was, in the 60s, believe it or not, trust in politicians peaked at 70% in America, and much the same here. Now it's down in the low 20s. The 60s, for all their fractious nature, was still communitarian. The radical left were trying to change society for the sake of the oppressed, for the sake of the Negroes, for the sake of the women, for the sake of the same-sex couples. And so there was a real communitarianism in the 60s that rapidly dissipated into the 70s. Things changed in the 70s. The Western economy started going downhill. Self-esteem became an obsession, thanks Ayn Rand and others, where people suddenly started to think that my purpose in life is to make myself happy more often of the time. And that has continued. So Robert Putnam, the great Harvard researcher, has put out a book a year ago called The Upswing, where he notes that communitarianism peaked in the mid-60s and has actually hit its lowest point in 2020.
Wow.
But it does this. So maybe we've bottomed out, maybe we haven't, but in theory, if we have, then we can come back to people actually starting to understand that they're part of something bigger. They're not individuals out to get everything they want for themselves,
Yeah. Also social media.
Indeed. Social media hasn't helped.
Catherine, you had a question?
Tony, I'd ask you about the underground culture. Obviously every era there's an underground culture, music culture bubbling away. So how much of that filtered through to here in the 60s, what cool kids listening to, like the Velvet Underground? Did anyone actually listen to them when they were in their heyday era? Or was it purely, bands decades past?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. The Velvet Underground are an interesting case in point because they really weren't big in America either at that time. Their influence was much later. Yeah. People suddenly started to listen and, grunge wouldn't have happened and, in a way, punk and garage bands. They were the first garage band in a way. So they weren't hugely influential. I remember seeing the Peel a Banana sticker on albums, but I didn't really understand what they were trying to do in the 60s, nor did many other people. And it was very difficult for them to get distribution because the album had to be withdrawn because there was a copyright issue over the back photo, all of that sort of stuff. But bands like MC5 and, even Led Zeppelin were considered underground at the time because they were breaking new ground. Now we look at them and we think, but lots of bands are like that.
Yeah.
But at the time, they really weren't.
Yes.
They really weren't. Inagata Davida doing one whole side of an album being one song with a massive drum solo in the middle was pretty avant-garde in its day, And so that was underground. Mainstream, lots of mainstream stuff was underground. Bubblegum wasn't underground. But, and that word underground was a real cachet, It was a real ticket to an inside society where young people really felt they were being different because they were appreciating underground. And Pink Floyd started off being an underground band. Soft Machine were underground, The problem for Australia was the size of the population. So it took a bit longer for a lot of that music to infiltrate here. But you still had things like Arthur Brown, The Crazy World of Arthur Brown's Fire, which was an extraordinary single for its day, and absolutely, you know, it broke teenage speakers, split them asunder with his, you know, his 4-octave range and his screams and hollers. And it was like no one had ever heard of it before. Even what Janis Joplin was doing for a woman, you know, the sort of noises that were coming out of her were really brave and adventurous in their day. And so, yeah, underground was a really important part of the thinking of the whole culture here. And I think in Australia, certainly from what I sort of saw at the time, and I was a little behind the ball, was people were grasping for it. We were trying to get hold of it. You know, and the MC5 album was released here, but of course they cut out the naughty bits and you know, all you know, the Fugs albums, you couldn't get at all unless you secretly imported them. So we're all, you know, you could go as deep underground as you wanted. And if you wanted to go really deep underground, then you had to find clever ways to get those albums.
Did you want to go to our Zoom?
Yes, we've got questions coming in from
Okay.
our Zoom audience. Michael says the 60s did refashion society. It did not achieve all its utopian goals, but it did set in place the template for decades to follow. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Absolutely, and I think he's encapsulated my book perfectly. Thank you, Michael.
We've got one from Toby. They say, do you think the lyrics had far more meaning and spoke to the 60s generation in contrast to more recent times that does not appear to create the social movements as occurred in the 60s?
Well, they don't generate the social movements because there's so much more music today, and the contemporary artists are not reaching as many people. The classic example in the 60s is Country Joe and the Fishers. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag, you know, about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
When he played that at Woodstock, the entire audience sung along and they all knew every word. And that's a pretty extraordinary kind of feat. And I think that would be hard to replicate today. But having said that, you know, after the George Floyd protests and events, there were plenty of protest songs being written by Megan Thee Stallion, by Beyonce. You know, there are plenty of protest songs being written. Their lyrics are really powerful and punchy. They're just not reaching as many people. They're not as universal.
Well, the thing is, too, people have said artists are still writing those songs, but radio aren't playing them.
Indeed. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
But then you're going to guess with the rise of Spotify, radio's kind of getting negated to some degree anyway, isn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, in the 60s, there was a big jump when FM in the mid-60s suddenly came into play and started to play sidelong albums and, you know, stop having the station jingles and the news and all of that and just focus on serious music.
Yeah.
And it took a while for that to kind of infiltrate here.
Well, we didn't get that till the 80s.
Yeah. Well, there was Room to Move in the 70s. Chris Winter's Room to Move on the ABC. I used to lie in bed late at night listening to Room to Move, and he'd play, you know, all sorts of stuff. I remember he played an album called Touch, which I absolutely loved from the 60s, but no one's ever heard of. And he managed to find a copy and we corresponded for a while about it, you know. So if you went hunting, it was there.
No, I mean more the FM sound.
Oh, the FM sound. It took a long while for FM to really catch on.
Another question?
Yes. So you did mention Woodstock. I'd love to know your thoughts. Was this kind of a culmination of music culture of the 60s? And just what are your general thoughts on Woodstock as a cultural and historical phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways of looking at the climax of the 60s as a decade. One is musically, and you'd have to argue that probably Woodstock is kind of the high point because it was all downhill from there when you get to Altamont at the end of the year with the killing and you know, everyone being off their faces and stuff. I mean, everyone was off their faces at Woodstock, but you know, there were no fights. There wasn't a punch thrown amongst 500,000 people. So in a way, the hippie ideal reached its zenith at Woodstock in terms of goodwill, and it was never quite captured again. Perhaps almost the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, but even there, the audience booed Joni Mitchell until she cried. You know, they were pretty aggressive. So Woodstock, but though Woodstock became eulogised, you've got to remember that when Jimi Hendrix came out and played Star Spangled Banner, there was only a handful of people left because he played after everyone had packed up and gone. He was playing a pile of rubbish. it was the movie of Woodstock that actually made Woodstock so famous. It wasn't the Woodstock event so much, it was the movie. And the movie was extraordinary. It was 3 hours long, which was unheard of, and they had to fight to get, you know, that length. And it was multi-screen in a way that no one had seen multi-screen before. And it absolutely captured the highs and lows of the event. And that put it into some sort of special category of its own, Woodstock Festival. Whereas when Gimme Shelter comes out about Altamont, you know, suddenly rock music doesn't look so nice.
No, absolutely not.
We've got a question from Jeff at home. It says, Tony, the Seekers were probably Australia's most successful international act in the 60s. Why was that? Was their music an outlier which did not fit in the 60s?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the 60s, it was early 60s that the Seekers broke through, and they broke through with a big wallop. And we've got to remember that it was a British gentleman who was a musician who both composed and produced their first 3 tracks that were huge hits internationally. And there was something about the Seekers that... Yes, Tom Springfield, thank you. Dusty Springfield's brother.
That's right, yeah.
Tom Springfield, well done, thank you, Sean.
That's all right.
I had a seniors boomers.
No.
But
What got me here for.
the Seekers were a clean-cut antidote, an anodyne version of the way rock music was heading in the early 60s. And so they were far more sort of family-friendly and acceptable. So it wasn't just young people, it was middle-aged people that were buying Seekers albums. I remember as a youngster going to my parents' friend's house and realising that they had all the Seekers albums and sitting and playing them and thinking, so that's what the Seekers sound like, you know. And I think, you know, their fame was a lucky break at a lucky moment in time when they provided just the formula that was needed, which was folk music with just a hint of rock.
I actually had a question. So the whole notion of music in the 60s putting young people on the map. And I'm really interested in fandom culture and fan theory. So my question is, do you think the 60s were pivotal in creating fans and then super fans? And was it young people who have really propelled the concept of fandom?
No, I think fandom started long before that. Fandom goes back to Frank Sinatra and the Bobby Soxers in the 1940s and 1950s. It goes to Johnny Ray that we talked about before. I think fandom was part and parcel of this shift that occurred in the 50s, where young people started to see themselves as separate from adulthood. And certainly the 60s kind of propelled fandom in an enormous way because there was such universality. I mean, I don't think that any young person could have missed actually listening to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band when it came out. You know, I think everyone, whether they liked the Beatles or not, would have heard it back then. That universality is a sort of fandom in itself. But today fandom is quite different because this is getting a bit convoluted, I know, but the 50s saw, bodgies, widgies, mods, rockers, etc., which was a way that young people managed to identify themselves as various subcultures. Those subcultures continued, and there were skinheads through the 60s, etc. But somehow in the middle of the 60s, when hippiedom happened and the summer of love happened, that subculture became much larger than any previous subculture. And it was much more universal. And, we all had our long hair, etc. And we all had tote bags. And we all wore flared jeans. And it was because youth saw itself as different, not subcultures of youth, but youth per se. Just for a period there, youth per se identified itself as being different. And it didn't have to somehow split into subcultures. Ultimately, of course, now today, you've got, much more serious subculture going on within the music scene and fandom. And I think, again, that's very much part of this shift from a communitarian culture to an individualistic culture.
We've also got a question from Sarah for both Sean and Tony.
And if you had to pick one, in your opinion, what was the most influential song or band of the decade?
Over to you, Tony.
As I said earlier, for a period there, I mean, the Beatles, undoubtedly, when the Beatles hit America in '64, record sales skyrocketed and stayed enormous for the rest of the decade. The Beatles were actually selling American R&B back to the Americans in a way that was more palatable to white ears rather than black ears. Nevertheless, they actually changed the nature of pop and rock and top 40 radio in a way that no one has ever bettered. And as I said before, between their early love songs and towards the middle end of their career, when they were really experimenting and taking on works by Stockhausen and everyone else, and they actually dragged popular music forward. But then popular music left them behind, and the trajectory continued into prog rock and glam and everything else that came after. And the Beatles had fractured by then. But without the Beatles, that trajectory wouldn't have happened. Whether it would have been another band, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I would say the Beatles too. I mean, you hear Motown, it's amazing. You hear other sort of music from around the world, amazing. You can find 100 great songs as good as the Beatles by 50 or 100 different artists. But the Beatles, those four guys themselves, had 100 great songs as good as anybody's. And as I said before, I think the fact that, from Love Me Do to Turn Off Your Mind, Relax, and Float Downstream is 3 years. It took me 3 years to get an arts degree. And I did that. It's remarkable. So,
and they still have, the record for them. They're only around for a handful of years, but they still have the record for the most #1 songs as composers.
Yeah.
McCartney and Lennon still have the record in America for the most #1 singles as composers. That's incredible. Amazing.
Do we have any other audience questions? Sean, did you have any final questions?
no, I really enjoyed chatting to you, Tony. I'm really
Thanks.
pleased you made the time to talk about the book, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It's very kind, very generous of you, Sean. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming from a real author.
That brings us to the end, everyone. Thank you so much for your time,
Thank
your expert interviewing, a fabulous, well-researched book. Ewan will link into the chat on Zoom where you can purchase Freak Out, and everyone here, you can grab your copy at the front. I feel like it's going to make a perfect Christmas present for a lot of dads and mums. Thank you again. Another round of applause.
Thank you, Robert.